as we kick off Women's History Month with our very special guest, Dr. Lori Ginzburg. I'm Ann Hesse, and it's my privilege to lead the Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus. Our moderator for today is Marnie Delaney, and we're so fortunate to have Marnie serving as on our GWC steering committee and leading our newest issue action team, Eliminating Violence Against Women. Please note that we will be gathering questions for Dr. Ginzberg from our chat box, so you're welcome to type in your questions along the way. Now I'd like to hand off to Marnie, who will tell us a bit more about Women's History Month. Take it away, Marnie.
My goodness. Thank you, Ann. Welcome, everyone. Women's History Month is a child of the 80s, very young in my point of view. It was born in 1987, to be exact, after the growth of women's studies classes in the 60s, and then the initiation of women's studies programs in the 70s. Obviously, the actual history of women's achievements began many centuries before, but those programs finally deemed women's lives, work, and issues worthy of study. But it took a long time for women to be recognized in textbooks, and an even longer time, apparently, to get into the Constitution. Hopefully that will be happening very soon. Nonetheless, as women continue to make history, the Global Women's Caucus wants to take this opportunity to contemplate and celebrate the past. And to help us do that, we do have a very wonderful guest who will be helping us to understand the women's movements and the fight for women's equality. And perhaps you can give us a little bit of an understanding of why such a simple idea seems to have gotten so darn complicated. So Dr. Ginsberg, thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Okay. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our guest first before we hear her
I'm sorry, Ann. Take it away.
So we know what we have here with us, who we have.
I completely
forgot. So here we go. Lori Ginzburg is a graduate of Oberlin College and received her MA and PhD from Yale University. Dr. Ginzburg is a historian in 19th century American women with a particular interest in intersections between intellectual and social history. She also teaches at Penn State, and she's written several books, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, An American Life, and Untitled Origins, a story of women's rights in antebellum New York. You will find links to more information on these books posted in our chat box any minute now. And leading up to last year's suffrage centennial in 2020, Dr. Ginsberg spoke throughout the country and on podcasts and radio shows about Stanton, the foremost intellectual activist of her generation, as well as about conflicts and complexities involved in commemoration itself. As a joint appointment in history and women's gender and sexuality studies, she's taught a wide range of courses in U.S. history, women's history, lesbian and gay history, and feminist theory. So, Dr. Ginzberg, welcome to our discussion. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Ann, and thanks to Marnie and Ann and Democrats Abroad for inviting me to join you today. To all of you, of course, for joining the conversation. I only wish it were in person. I say that a lot lately. I hope in a fairly short time, not so much to teach you the history of the women's rights movement, but to complicate how we think about history, commemoration, and voting itself. I look forward to your questions and arguments about all of this. There's a lot you could read. I'll only mention a few things along the way. If you're interested in the U.S. Centennial Commission's work on the 19th Amendment, they have a website now housed by the National Park Service called, I did not name this, called Suff-Buffs, that you might check out. So I want to start there at the end of today's story with the 2020 commemoration of the 19th Amendment and get one thing out of the way early on. Let's just stop saying that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave American women the right to vote. Many women could vote before the amendment was ratified, and many could not vote after it. Prior to its passage, women in 15 states could already vote on an equal basis with men. 12 other states granted women so-called presidential suffrage. Before the 19th Amendment appeared in the Constitution, in other words, politicians or male voters in a majority of states had passed and learned to live with women's suffrage. More important, Not all American women could vote after the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Women in Puerto Rico remained disenfranchised because the amendment only prohibited the states, not the territories, from limiting the vote on the basis of sex. And it took another 9 years for the Puerto Rican legislature to grant literate women the right to vote. Women who married foreign men, but not the reverse, automatically lost their citizenship, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter found to her dismay. And in the South, Black women, like Black men, remained largely disenfranchised. In the face of leading white suffragists' refusal to work against Jim Crow voter suppression, African American women worked long after the passage of the 19th Amendment to make its guarantees a reality. Rather than the 19th Amendment, it was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court has since gutted, that guaranteed all American women the right to vote. Ironically, even as we commemorate the partial expansion of democracy represented by the 19th Amendment, we are also witnessing intense efforts to suppress particular votes, to disrupt democratic engagement, and to undermine electoral processes we often take for granted, all of which should remind us that how we commemorate our history in spaces that range from museums to memorials to flags to national anthem singing and to building names matters. But much as we try to simplify our celebrations, history, and right around now is where I can see my students' eyes rolling, is complicated. Now to return to what we consider the beginning. I'm always happy to talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I do hope you'll read my biography of her. The centennial of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution has provided a chance to celebrate her bold and outrageous demands for women's right to own property, to acquire an education, to exercise a vote, to speak out, to get a divorce. The very thing Stanton was referring to when she said, "This sounds like a very radical proposition now, but be sure that someday in the future, Americans will ask how these things could ever have been done otherwise." As the founding philosopher for the movement for women's rights, she belongs by any measure in the pantheon of people who shaped the United States and who redefined democracy itself. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a complex person, infuriating and fascinating. She was brilliant, charming, and charismatic, as well as self-righteous, intimidating, and astonishingly self-confident. The mother of 7 children, an advocate of liberalized divorce laws, and a skeptic about religion, she comes across her 87 years as larger than life, a woman driven by her commitment to rouse herself and everyone else to rethink and remake women's status in politics, law, religion, and marriage. But at the risk of being a party pooper, what Sarah Ahmed in Living a Feminist Life so aptly calls a feminist killjoy, I want to stress my arguments with Stanton and with the process of commemoration itself. Because Stanton, for all her intellectual courage, made comments so racist that they can leave us speechless. Unlike some historians, and to the dismay of people who want to celebrate the US's and our movement's progress, I believe that Stanton's racism and elitism were not merely warts, but reflected a thread in her thinking that was pervasive and longstanding. I stress this not only because I am, in fact, a feminist killjoy, out to disrupt people's investments in the happy story of ever-expanding progress, but because these disruptions have implications for our own notions and practice of democracy, feminism, and social justice. A few basics about Stanton's life help explain her confidence, her indignation, and her perspective. Elizabeth Cady was born in Johnstown, New York in 1815, the daughter of Daniel and Margaret Livingston Cady. Her father, who became a judge, was wealthy. He owned several slaves and a lot of land, well-connected, and deeply conservative, especially as his daughter recalled on matters of gender. Stanton's most vivid and oft-repeated story was that of a boisterous and rebellious little girl, 11 years old, whose only living brother had just died. Distraught, she crawled into her father's lap, seeking to give and receive comfort, but her father put his arm around her and sighed, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." The sting of the father's remark lingers. Many girls and women can relate to the insult. Elizabeth Cady, as it turned out, had more than enough reserves of self-esteem to survive the slap, though she never forgot it, and she retained a strong sense of insult and exclusion. Throughout her life, she insisted that society's preference for boys dwarfed girls' lives, limited their opportunities, and was used to justify the denial of women's rights. Just as Stanton saw this story as the heart of her own intellectual and political awakening, movements too have their origin story. The one we hear most often about the women's rights movement is that it began at a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, which Stanton and a few friends called in the summer of 1848. That gathering was not the first time women had publicly demanded their full and equal rights, but Stanton and her friend Susan B. Anthony, who, by the way, wasn't at Seneca Falls, would be extremely effective at shaping the memory of the movement to emphasize its and their significance. Anyone interested in that topic, I recommend Lisa Tétrault's book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, a wonderful book. Even at the time, the 300 or so people who attended the convention knew that the ideas expressed there had not emerged in a vacuum. In spite of what Elizabeth Cady Stanton claimed about her own originality and radicalness, not one person who attended the convention at Seneca Falls was hearing about women's rights for the first time. By the 1840s, newspaper editors, ministers, educators, legislators, and reformers had been debating the issue of women's rights for years, and some communities fairly buzzed with such talk. That conversation had been most contentious within the anti-slavery movement, and it was abolitionists, women and men both, who gathered at Seneca Falls and then 2 weeks later in Rochester, New York, to demand and discuss women's rights. These people were radicals, ultraists was the term then, part of the tiny community of anti-slavery activists who most white Americans, North and South, believed were threatening to turn the nation upside down. They were widely considered, to use a term from our own time, the lunatic fringe, demanding things that other folks declared not just wrong or bad, but unthinkable. Adding women's rights to their inflammatory rhetoric about ending slavery and racism just proved how very dangerous they were. Still, while the notion that women be treated as individuals with the same rights as men was not unthinkable to the people who gathered at Seneca Falls and is now barely up to question, the document Stanton and her friends produced in 1848, the so-called Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, was extraordinary, a foundational text in American democratic ideals. Its language, careful and deliberate, made these dangerous radicals impossible to ignore. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Stanton read aloud, that all men and women are created equal, and then proceeded to list numerous repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, the laws of marriage, restrictions against women entering the professions, religious teachings that silenced them, social norms that created a double standard of morality, and a society that sought, as Stanton put it, to destroy her confidence in her own powers. By adopting the language of the nation's most sacred text, Stanton reminded Americans that their revolution had left unfinished business and urged them to do better. It underscored Stanton's conviction that women's rights fit squarely within the nation's traditions of equality and rebellion, that by crushing, constraining, and belittling women, the pursuit of happiness itself had been denied them. All this talk about women as independent, rights-bearing citizens left its listeners, supporters, as well as appalled opponents, breathless. Some newspaper editors could only sputter incoherently with outrage. Characteristically, I think maybe you won't be so surprised to learn, rather than discuss the actual issues at hand, they resorted to emotional outbursts against the women's looks, clothing, and marriage prospects, calling into question what we would call their sexual and gender identity. Stanton's words can still, if we listen closely, remind us of the radical potential of individual rights, including, but not only, the right to vote. Stanton, who never focused long on any one idea, she disagreed with her friend Susan B. Anthony, who came to believe that winning the vote should be their only important goal. Stanton was brilliant at expanding these fundamentally liberal views of women's status to a radical critique of religious teachings, of the marriage contract, and of women's sexual subordination to men. For the dozen or so years that followed the first women's rights conventions, even the most passionate women's rights supporters viewed ending slavery as their most important task. There wasn't yet an autonomous women's suffrage movement. But the Civil War, in addition to everything else, transformed reformers' relationship to politics itself, and voting itself gained a new importance. Many older white abolitionists, a large number of them Quakers, had long believed that they worked only for a moral cause, and they abstained from electoral politics, which they believed, and which of us would argue, necessarily involved compromise and complicity. But with the debates over and then passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the rough and tumble world of Reconstruction politics, there was little enough moral purity to go around, and politics seemed the only game in town. Women's suffrage was very much part of this mix. It was then that anti-slavery activists, some of whom were effectively becoming the progressive wing of the Republican Party, differed. Should they support a 15th Amendment that guaranteed Black men's voting rights, or hold out for an amendment that granted the vote to women as well? The conflict, as Stanton and Anthony saw it, and many historians have agreed, was between their own principled commitment to universal rights and their colleagues' apparent selling out to a political party that only needed the votes of men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's rhetoric on behalf of universal rights sounded wonderful on the stump. Some tell us that this is not the time for women to make the demand, that this is the Negro's hour, she declared in 1867. No, my friends, this is the nation's hour. This is the hour to settle what are the rights of a citizen of the Republic. This was powerful stuff, which Stanton expressed as a moral imperative with which no thinking person could disagree. But thinking people did disagree. The right of woman to vote is as sacred in my judgment as that of man, Frederick Douglass insisted, and I am quite willing at any time to hold up both hands in favor of this right. What Douglass argued in the face of mounting racist violence in the South was that the crisis facing the Black community was simply more urgent. And though Stanton refused to acknowledge it, his rhetoric was chilling. He went on. When women, because they are women, are hunted down through the streets of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burned down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. Unable or unwilling to hear this argument and feeling betrayed by her friends, male and female both, who seemed prepared to trade away women's rights, Stanton could have stuck to the lofty rhetoric of universal justice. Instead, fired up with indignation and insult, she let loose some extraordinarily racist remarks to the effect that educated white women were more fit to vote than recently emancipated African American men. I'll spare you a litany of quotations and offer only a few. Protected by the 13th Amendment, Stanton announced, the Black man is declared free. But, and I quote, as the celestial gate to civil rights is slowly moving on its hinges, it becomes a serious question whether the representative women of the nation had better stand aside and see Sambo walk into the kingdom first. As for Black women, it is better, Stanton declared firmly, if inexplicably, to be the slave of an educated white man than of a degraded, ignorant Black one. Furious at friends who had agreed to postpone women's suffrage, and clothed in her identification as a true and worthy American, she turned the full force of her anger and resentment on Black men themselves. Stanton remained oblivious to the hurt in her friend Frederick Douglass's words when he objected to her employment of certain names such as Sambo and the Gardener and the Bootblack and the daughters of Jefferson and Washington and all the rest I cannot coincide with. Yet there was more at stake here than mere figures of speech, thoughtless slips of the tongue and the pen. In staking her claim to universal rights on the basis of the priority of white women's individual rights, Stanton damaged her friendships, her movement, and her claims to the purest radicalism, and I believe democracy itself. For Stanton, African Americans' emancipation was no longer the central crisis for her generation and her country. Rather, the Negro question was over. "The curtain has fallen on the last act," she wrote in 1868. "The lights are extinguished and the audience gone to their homes." In the face of the terrible racial violence of the post-war period, Stanton, who often boasted of her genius for napping, did not lose much sleep. A principled consistency can be thrilling, and Stanton's fiery words in behalf of women's rights offer stunning moments of political absolutism in the American political tradition. But in real life, there are choices to be made, and they are rarely as easy or obvious as she implied. Many of you will recognize the quandary. But more was at stake here than a battle between principle and strategy. The division among former allies in part expressed different views of the vote itself, whether as a purely individual acquisition or as a community tool. To Stanton, an exclusively male vote, what she called an aristocracy of sex, was an important symbol of women's subordination, one that damaged women's self-esteem and so prevented their full equality. Being denied the vote was insulting, degrading. Women needed the vote, Stanton believed, to be independent, to feel as worthy as men, to see themselves not as wives and mothers, but as full citizens of society, the church, their families, and the state. She never gave much thought, as a later generation would, to what women would do with the vote. Within other communities, including recently emancipated African Americans, and a few decades later, communities of immigrants and working class activists, the meaning of the vote was different. And other rights of citizenship, owning land, protecting and educating one's children, making an adequate living, having recourse to law, being safe from sexual assault, trusting that the police will protect you, may have simply mattered more. As Elsa Barkley Brown has argued in her work on Richmond, Virginia, for newly freed African Americans, the vote was less an individual symbol of freedom than a community possession, an essential tool for self and community protection and advancement. Far more than white women, African American women in the Reconstruction South, although technically voteless, attended conventions and elections, spoke out at meetings, and expected to be heard. Thus, the New York Times reported that female domestic servants had missed work to attend Richmond's 1867 local meeting of the Constitutional Convention. Not only had Sambo gone to the convention, the reporter noted smirkingly, but Dinah was there also. Outside convention halls, children and women participated in the voice votes that, quote, made plans for freedom. Formerly enslaved women kept their men in line if they drifted from the Republican Party. They argued forcefully for their right to legal protection against sexual assault by white men. They demanded control over their women's futures. For African American women, the vote was essential, but it mattered less who exercised it individually as long as it was used in the larger interests of their besieged and threatened community. In many ways, by the late 19th century, along with the expansion of women's suffrage and the movement to advance it, the notion of women as voters had come to seem safer, more respectable, certainly more mainstream. New constituencies, notably small-town white women associated with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, had become convinced that gaining a vote would allow women to protect the purity of the home. Indeed, both as activists and voters, they played an important role in the passage of the 18th Amendment, which established prohibition. But other groups also endorsed women's right to vote, reflecting the movement's more radical appeal and, of course, mirroring deep divisions that have long characterized the United States. Increasingly, socialists, racial justice advocates, union leaders, working class immigrants, birth control activists, and others came to see the vote not as an end in itself, certainly not as their only or their primary cause, but as a tool to empower and protect their communities and advance their goals. For them, the 19th Amendment was not an ending, but a step in a long struggle. Thus, for instance, as new books by Martha Jones, Kathleen Cahill, and Allison Parker have shown, women of color largely supported women's suffrage on behalf of other movements for social justice. Suffrage was for them not so much a symbol of individual independence, but a tool to support the rights of struggling communities. It would be hard to name an African-American woman who actually opposed granting the vote to women. But many, perhaps most Black women, joined the movement to resist Black men's disfranchisement in the South. Similarly, members of the Socialist Party and labor unions demanded the vote so that wages, both women's and men's, could be raised, workplaces made safer, organizing protected, and other rights of citizenship advanced. Many of these activists were wary, and justifiably so, of white middle-class suffragists who claimed to speak in the name of all women. Black activists were especially mistrustful of being invited to sit at a suffrage table with openly racist Southern women. This does not, by the way, require a subtle reading of the evidence. Gail Kearney, active in Mississippi's women's suffrage organizations, declared explicitly and publicly that the enfranchisement of women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy, honestly attained. Expecting African-American activists to put up with this in the interest of all women, like Stanton's own failures of moral vision, were not temporary or strategic errors. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, African-American women implored suffrage leader Alice Paul to use those brand new votes and her own political influence to help them oppose Jim Crow, and she refused. Similarly, Carrie Chapman Catt tried to distance the suffrage movement from radical and working class voters who, by the way, had gotten women's suffrage ratified in New York in 1917, and contributed to the image of feminism itself as a white middle class woman, and to a narrative that allows textbooks and popular celebrations to declare that with the 19th Amendment, feminists had achieved their major goal. I would bet that few of us here, no matter where you're living, would choose to give up individual rights. The notion that rights inhere in each of us pervades American society, politics, popular culture, and career advice. But focusing exclusively on individual liberty and choice is itself a privilege, one that limits movements for social justice and can distort their goals. It shapes what counts as women's rights and which ones we celebrate as progress. So when we commemorate the 19th Amendment without addressing its limitations, when we say, yes, it was incomplete, but it was a great victory for women, we perpetuate a narrow view of which women and which rights matter. Also, our insistence that we are respectable, however we define that we are only making safe demands, that no, we're not stepping onto a slippery slope, just doesn't work. Because while advocates of women's suffrage scrambled to distance themselves from the movement's anti-slavery roots and from its more radical supporters, opponents of women's suffrage did not forget. They recognized the power of group politics. They feared, as people who would suppress votes, which always means particular votes, still do, that too much democracy would destroy the nation they wanted to build. And they used history, or their version of it, to express their views. I'll offer just one example. In the fall of 1920, with women's suffrage a done deal in the Constitution, the Woman Patriot, which was dedicated to the defense of womanhood, motherhood, the family, and the state against suffragism, feminism, and socialism, long masthead, they exhorted their readers to keep fighting, reminding them that the movement's origins lay in another moment of political transformation and emancipation. Women's suffrage was inextricable, they wrote, from the other twin, the damnable 15th Amendment, which was forced upon the then helpless South. Think about this plea to historical memory. 30 years after African-American men had been disenfranchised by the reestablishment of white supremacy in the South, the hostility to their ever having voted is jolting, and it should have sobered some of the suffrage celebrations. Nor did the paper's attack against what they called the feminist lobby onslaught stop there. Remember, the Woman Patriot warned, nobody but the mentally blind ever expected the feminist movement to stop at the winning of the vote, as they went on to quote from the Birth Control Review. If anti-suffragists' continued opposition to women's suffrage evokes their great sense of danger, it should remind us both of the radical possibilities of demands for legal equality and the modest possibilities of electoral reform. It should make us pause before we label something part of the lunatic fringe, too radical even to consider. Every one of us has benefited and cannot imagine living without demands that were once declared unthinkable. Honoring the history of the women's rights movement and the process of commemoration itself requires that we recall how scary those demands were and how the compromises activists made to make it seem less frightening were all too often anti-democratic and racist. Let's embrace the possibilities of the slippery slope and listen harder to suffrage supporters who thought that the vote was a beginning and that having it and using it could help gain a fair wage, healthcare, a decent education, safety at work, an end to lynching, recourse in the face of sexual violence, and a voice in their local and national communities. Elizabeth Cady Stanton never could focus on just one goal, and neither should we. Over and over, she was positive that she had found what she called the one true cause of women's subordination, whether it was in man's idea of his sexual rights or the oppression of women in biblical texts. She could hardly contain her glee at her own cleverness and wrote happily to her long-suffering friend, Susan B. Anthony, whenever she had moved on. "My feeling," Stanton declared at 75, "is to tone up rather than down." The possibility of Stanton toning down was not a major concern of Anthony's, who, although devoted to her friend, was sometimes exhausted by her galloping intellect. Stanton herself was happiest, she said, when hurling my thunder at both friends and opponents. And yet, she could or would not evaluate her own prejudices, her racism, or her astonishing self-regard, nor would she acknowledge the moral complexity of those who disagreed with her. All of us breathe the air of her legacy, one that celebrates ideas that can seem old-fashioned: liberty, equality, equal rights, independence. So we should applaud her insights and praise her work and then hurl some thunder back. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Oh my goodness. It's a complicated history, isn't it? Oh my goodness.
I did warn you of that.
Yes, you did. So one of the things, you've shown us that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a radical thinker, and that there were probably some more other radical thinkers around her throughout the feminist movement. But how in general do you think women have figured within the various more radical movements in history, in U.S. history?
I don't really know what you mean. You mean, have they been leaders of other movements?
Yeah, yes.
I mean, they've certainly been leaders of movements against lynching, for racial justice, against slavery, and for civil rights. They, African American women began and founded and led most of those movements in one way or another. There's movements we don't consider that progressive, like the temperance and prohibition movements that women were certainly leaders of.
Yes.
And they're among the first union organizers and major strikers in this country. It's just that we tend to focus, we need to always be asking ourselves which women we're talking about and which movements.
Yeah. How do you think Elizabeth Cady Stanton ended up where she ended up? Because you describe her as the incident with her father looking at her. I think it's a very stark story, and I just wonder, where did she get that confidence, and where did she get her vision for the big picture?
Well, I can't really, the confidence part, is somewhat of a psychological question that I can't answer. Like many women who became prominent in many different times of history, she sought her father's approval, which she never really got all the time. She was very well educated for a girl of her time. She got the best education at the Emma Willard School that was available to her, but she harbored a very deep and open resentment about the boys who were not as good students as she was, who then went off to Union College, and she did not have, there was no college available to her. She spent a lot of time in her father's law study. This is how people went to law school then. They more or less clerked and studied under a judge rather than going to a formal training. And she spent a lot of time in there, as she described it, reading the law books and arguing with the young men. And then when she was visiting her cousin Gerrit Smith's house in 1839 or so, she met this young man who was an abolitionist lecturer named Henry Brewster Stanton, 10 years her senior. who could talk a blue streak and who was very admiring of her intelligence. And, you know, she must have been quite a lively and brilliant person to both admire his thinking and to chat with. And they ended up getting married against her father's wishes a year later and going to the London Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840 as their honeymoon. I think,
Oh my.
and Henry Stanton, who was very ambitious and wanted to have a life in politics, never came close to the fame that his wife did. And I think he was just blindsided by her ambition to change things. And, you know, I think she was in a position where she had the money and household help and friend support and community support to form what she considered standalone feminism. You know, she's somewhat younger than the generation of abolitionists who faced the most resistance to their movement. So she was able to benefit from their years of activism without ever having to really face the hardships they did. And she viewed feminism as the most important cause of her life.
I see a question in our chat box, which is, let's see. I can't see who it. Shelley Anderson is asking, were there any white suffragists who understood the need for Black women's enfranchisement and who actually came out and criticized Stanton's racism?
Yeah, there were. I mean, Lucy Stone, for her, with her own, you know, moral and political complexity, argued against Stanton about the 15th Amendment. It was very painful for her to come to this decision, but she came to decide that, along with Frederick Douglass, that it was more urgent that the Black community have the vote. And the women that she allied with often shared that view as well.
That's great. Yeah. If you were, I'm going to ask you, what are the things that you, if you could be Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what are the qualities that you would want to have and would want to let go?
It's very hard to put yourself in place of someone who lived hundreds of years before you.
Give it a whirl.
You know, it would be great to have I mean, she had a lot of self-confidence and charisma, and she was apparently really blew people away by her presence. There's some moment where she and Susan B. Anthony, who was no slouch in the public speaking department herself, were on a Western tour. And finally, as Stanton went home first, and Anthony wrote to her niece and said, or her sister, I forgot who wrote to her niece or sister, and said, you know, I love Mrs. Stanton, but it is so hard to walk into the room after that woman. So much of the energy. And I imagine she was really charismatic in the way sometimes it's an elusive quality. We see this sometimes, not that often, but sometimes we see it with politicians where there's just a way that they own the room. And, you know, she was quite amazing, I think, as a personality. She, you know, she would sit at a dinner table and give a secular grace, thanking the person whose hands had labored over the food that we were about to eat. You know, she was quite amazing, but she was incredibly elitist and arrogant and not very complimentary to women as a group, I must say. She thought all women except herself were basically downtrodden area rugs. You know, not very, you know, she was very condescending. But
oh, God.
She was raised with that. I think she was really raised in many ways as her father's daughter, although he didn't have a son to follow him.
What I'm thinking, when we look at women's history, what and the feminist movement, what do you think some of the big lessons or the biggest lesson, whatever you want to do, for not just women but for men too? What if everybody went to your class, what would be the thing you would want people to really learn?
Well, I don't. It's what I've been talking about today. I don't think the lesson's any different for men than for women. Be careful what you compromise away and who you throw under the bus, or something you've decided is your main goal. Always, whenever you say the word women, ask which women. Always, every time you say women, ask yourself which women. You know, and don't pretend that some people aren't going to give up privileges when other people get more rights. There are enough rights to spread around, but there are also ways that people have enormous privileges over other people, or that other people don't have. and it's foolish to pretend that it's not going to hurt
Yeah,
sometimes.
a lot.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. So, all right. So we've decided that maybe we've been misled about some of the big moments for women's movement. Were there big turning points when women, maybe realized, what were the big turning points where women realized that they were missing a right, or that they'd lost something, or that, something bad had happened? Or or big moments where they gained something? What if during this period of time that you're talking about, and maybe a little after it, what were some of the big moments?
And it's the same. It's the same question that I just raised. I think you'd have to say which women. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was an enormous moment. And I think we
Yes.
know, and the way that we know that is by looking at the opposition. If you look at people who are still trying to suppress votes, they're not trying to suppress everybody's votes. They're trying to suppress certain votes. And when you look at how hard they're working to suppress votes in Georgia, they're working to suppress loyal Democratic voters. And we know that. So I would say, when you want to know what's a major event, look at the opposition. And if the opposition is getting crazed and dramatic and, screaming, or for that matter, I don't know, breaking down walls in the Capitol, whatever it is that they're doing, you need to ask, what have we done to rouse up this kind of opposition?
Right. Wait, here. Oh, sorry.
I'm just saying, look at the backlash. Always be aware of the backlash.
Yeah, that's good. So, okay, two questions here. Somebody is asking, Frances Watkins Harper, who's a writer and activist who turned away from Stanton because of the split over the 15th Amendment. Black women were forced to march separately from the white women, which I'm not sure is completely true, but how can we reunite in our efforts and overcome the ever persistent polarization?
Okay, but that's a really good question. It's two different time periods.
Yeah.
Just in case, I'm sure the questioner knows, but let me just, in case other people aren't clear about it. Frances Watkins Harper was an African-American woman who really struggled with this. I mean, she really liked Stanton and Anthony in some ways, but she struggled with them until she broke off and decided that it was more important for Black men to have the vote on behalf of their communities after the Civil War. I think what the person is talking about the march is the 1913 suffrage march in Washington,
Right.
where there was talk about segregating Black women and asking them to march separately, but they didn't all do that. Some of that, I mean, Alice Paul was bad about this, but there was this sense that the movement, that it was not a good look to force Black women to march separately. They hoped they would want to. This is a longstanding hope of white activists that non-white people will just want to be separate and
Right.
in the back of the march, but it didn't happen. A number of people, Ida Wells Barnett famously in the Illinois division, but Black women also in their college divisions, Mary Church Terrell, and a lot of women did not march in segregated settings.
Yeah.
And the question was what to do about this. Well, I think what to do about it is be really careful what you decide is the only important goal. I'm not a historian of the 20th century, I'm a historian of the 19th, but it still gives me pain to think that after the victory of the 19th Amendment, where white women suffragists had said, just let this get passed and then we'll deal with other issues, when Black activists went to Alice Paul and said, okay, now are you going to help us work against Jim Crow? And she said, no, not where I'm putting my energy. And she proposed an Equal Rights Amendment, which, was very helpful to business and professional women, not so helpful to disenfranchised Black men and women in the South. And, I think that it's always worth asking the question about who benefits and whose priorities are you choosing?
Well, what do you think are then for the people you're talking about? Let's say the most disenfranchised people in the United States today. What do you think are the issues? I'm gonna jump in and say voting rights, but
I think voting rights is important and fighting voter suppression. But recently someone said to me, what do you think should be the main women's issues of today? And I would say, to benefit the most women in this country right now, we need a $15 minimum wage, universal health care, and free childcare. Those are not the things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton would instantly recognize as her major women's issues. None of them would have helped her. Well, maybe helped her, but I mean, she could afford any of those things.
Yeah.
And so but if you want to really talk about what would help women the most, I think it would be those issues.
Yeah.
They're not
Thank you.
flashy as some other things.
All right. I'm going to just jump at, I want to ask my fellow folks on if there are any, Jamie, do we have any other questions that we want to?
Yeah, thanks, Marnie. We've been watching Facebook and everyone has been liking and commenting that they are watching from all over the world. And I actually have a question for Dr. Ginsberg, and you kind of just answered it. I'm wondering, when the Women's March started and then continued over the last 4 years, and what your perspective is and how it compares to the suffragist movement of that time. Is there a comparison there? And do you think the Women's March movement has made progress towards these things like paid childcare, $15 an hour? Or do you think it's just a messy, peaceful protest that that women, particularly white women, felt like they were becoming activists?
You're talking about the marches that started after Inauguration Day in 2017, right?
Yes.
Right. I was very cranky that day. I was very cranky at the march because I was just very unhappy by the sort of prioritizing of white women's issues and those hats and all this kind of stuff. But I think that those marches happened in a context of resistance to the past presidential administration. I don't think they were particularly proactive, although many, many women, white and Black, ran for office in the wake of the election of 2016. So there's no question that that had an impact. Whether those people who ran for office will then support the broadest possible goals for women, I don't know yet. I mean, some of it, we've been in resistance mode for 4 years. We don't know yet what it's going to look like to be able to take the offensive. And then, of course, there's the pandemic. And of course, there's cleaning up the last 4 years and just sort of making things function again. I don't know yet what a proactive feminist movement will demand. I do know that the best activism I see around me comes from Black Lives Matter, women involved in Black Lives Matter at its leadership. And I would like to think that many white women in the predominantly white women's movement have noticed that that's the new leadership and that they should be listening to what their demands are. I mean, I know, I live in Philadelphia. There's an enormous amount of gun violence. I know that a major demand spearheaded by women in my community is to have serious gun control. I don't know that the white dominated women's movement will take that on as a major goal. I just don't know.
Well, I think, well, first of all, I think we're at pretty much at our time. I can't even tell you how many great points that, questions you've raised in my mind, and sort of turning, I think a lot of people probably that are listening really would like to thank you for just opening up our minds to asking those right questions. It's really appreciated. Do you have anything that you wanted to say just as a kind of closing thought?
No, I just, always ask which women and always ask about the people who are hardest hit among us.
I think that's good advice. And I think we really appreciate you coming.
Okay.
Thanks.
My
And there's
goodness.
Anne. I know. My
Dr.
mind is
Ginsberg,
reeling.
I've learned so much today, and it's not all good. It's a much more complicated issue than I ever thought. And now I have to go get that book, both of your books, or several of them, and do some reading myself. I'm so far behind. Anyway, thank you so much.
Having fun.
We really appreciate your taking the time and digging into this very complicated issue for us, teaching us all. And I wish we had much more time. Did you have any other comments that you wanted to make for us, or before we wrap up?
Really.
Good.
Okay, all right. Then I'll have to say thank you. And to all of you who are listening, thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I have. And I'd like to remind you that our next GWC webinar will be commemorating International Women's Day on Monday, March 8th, by talking with Ms. Magazine Executive Editor, Catherine Spiller. So if you haven't signed up yet, you can follow the link in the chat box and find out more about this event and the others that we'll be having throughout the month. We'd love to see you there. And in closing, I'd like to give a big shout out to all of our volunteers in front of us, the camera and behind, and doing all kinds of things for our group around the globe. Yeah, it's so, and I'd like to remind all of you out there that we'd love to have you working with us too, because as a GWC volunteer, there really is a satisfaction in knowing that we too are making history. We're making women's history, adding to the story in small but important ways in this continuing struggle for women's empowerment. And I think we've learned some lessons from Dr. Ginsberg today that we can apply tomorrow and going forward in making it a better movement. So please consider joining our team. Our links will be in the chat box. But for now, we're going to say goodbye and close the call. And thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.